Okay, what we're going to take a look at in this particular lesson, lesson 4.7, dealing with something called inverse linear functions. And so when we look at inverse linear functions, let's just take a look at here. It says inverse relation. So this is the first part of the inverse linear functions that we're going to look at. Okay, the first half here dealing with inverse relations. So as we've talked about in the past, we know that with a relation, a relation is a set of ordered pairs. Okay, a set of ordered pairs. That is a relation. And specifically when we look at inverse relation, that is the set of ordered pairs obtained by exchanging the x and the y coordinates. So very simply, all you do is you take your x coordinates and your y coordinates and you switch them. Okay, that's how you find the inverse of each relation. So for example, okay, we take a look, this is the original set of ordered pairs, the one in black. So if we go 1, -2, -3, 1, 2, -4, well, the inverse relation to that would be, and all we do is we just exchange the x and the y coordinates. So the inverse relation would be -2, +1, 1, -3, and then -4, +2. So once again, all we did is we just switched the x and the y coordinates. And all I did down here is I just plotted those. So these are the original, the dots in black, and then the ones in orange, I guess for Halloween or something. But anyway, we got the ones in orange. Okay, the ones in orange which are dealing with the inverse relation. Okay, so that's what the inverse relation is in reference to. Okay, so let's take a look at dealing with inverse functions. This is really the meat of the lesson here. Okay, dealing with inverse functions. Okay, these are your 4 steps in finding the inverse function. So to find the inverse function, step number 1, you're going to replace the f of x with the variable y. Of course, f of x and y are interchangeable. Okay, y, of course, is when we're dealing with the range or with y coordinates. Step 2, interchange the y and the x in the equation. So we just talked about actually doing that within a relation. Okay, interchanging or switching the x and the y. All right, then for step 3, solve for y. And finally, at the very end of solving for the inverse, replace y with f of -1 and then x. So this is just telling you this is the inverse function. Okay, inverse function. Okay, so let's take a look at an example. Okay, so the first example that we're going to take a look at is f of x is equal to 4x minus 8. Okay, so with this particular function, okay, step number 1, because it says up here for step number 1, you're going to replace the f of x with the variable y. Okay, step 1. Okay, real simple. That's all we're doing for step 1. Okay, then for step number 2. Okay, step number 2, we are going to interchange the x and the y. In other words, they just switch spots. All right, so once we do that, okay, then we move into step number 3. Okay, step number 3 is a little more involved. Okay, for step 3, what we're going to do, we're going to actually solve for y. So to solve for y, okay, I'm going to start off. We got basically a 2-step equation, kind of like literal equations we talked about. I believe it was back in chapter 2, or maybe it was 1. But anyway, back in the past when we talked about literal equations, okay, with literal equations we're solving for a variable. So that's what we're doing here, we're solving for the variable y. So to solve for y, the first step, of course, we're going to add the 8. So we have x is equal to 4y minus 8. We're going to add the 8 first. So that leaves us with x plus 8 is equal to 4y. And then we still need to isolate the y, so we're going to do division, divide by 4. So we end up with 1/4 x plus 8, plus 2 is equal to y. Okay, so that is step 3. Step 3 is the most involved process. And finally, we're going to look at step number 4. Here's step number 4. Okay, we're going to replace the y with f of -1x. And so that's just going to look like this, f negative 1x is equal to 1/4 x plus 2. So really that is, it looks like it's in slope-intercept form. Okay, it's just that the difference is instead of having a y here, we have this f of negative 1x, indicating that we have the inverse function, okay, its inverse of the original. Okay, so the inverse function of this original function would be 1/4 x plus 2. Okay, so let's take a look at the second example. On the second example, we have f of x is equal to negative 1/2 x plus 11. Okay, so think through your steps. Okay, step number 1. Okay, what are we doing for step number 1? Okay, for step number 1, what we're going to do to begin with is we're replacing the f of x with y. Okay, step number 2, that's step 1. Step 2, of course, now what we're going to do next, we're going to interchange the x and the y. Okay, step number 3, then we're going to solve for y. So if we're going to solve for y, first step we're going to do first is subtract the 11. And then, of course, now this one, since we have a fraction, we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. Okay, multiply by the reciprocal. So in multiplying by the reciprocal, we're going to multiply by negative 2. So we're going to multiply by negative 2 times x minus 11. So it gives us negative 2x plus 22 is equal to y. And finally, for step number 4, we're just going to interchange. We go 4 negative 1x is equal to negative 2x plus 22. Okay, and that's it. That is your answer. Okay, I'm going to take you through one more problem, let you see one more. Okay, this one has a fraction in it. So for this one, we have f of x, okay, which is equal to 5/9 times x minus 18. And actually, before I begin step 1, I'm going to simplify this to begin with, and then we'll move into step number 1. Okay, so first thing, in order to simplify, I'm just going to distribute the 5/9. So in distributing the 5/9, now when I multiply 5/9 times 18, I can actually cross cancel here. And in cross canceling, of course, I'm going to end up with minus 10. Okay, we get a 2 right there. So of course, cross cancel. Now we have f of x is equal to 5/9 x minus 10. Okay, now we can begin, go with our first step. So step number 1, of course, replace f of x with y. Okay, step number 2, we're going to interchange x and y. Step number 3, I'm going to solve for y. Now, on this one, since we do have a fraction as a coefficient, once again, like last time, we are going to multiply by the reciprocal. It's going to look a little bit different this time. So we go 9 fifths times x plus 10 is equal to y. And when we distribute, that gives us 9 fifths x. Of course, we can cross cancel here. That gives us 2. And multiply, and that gives us 18. And finally, for step number 4, okay, exchange. We got f of negative 1. Okay, x is equal to 9 fifths x plus 18. And that's it. Okay, that is your final answer. That is the inverse function.